And so this first one is from Victoria Safford, a minister's minister who's serving, I think now in Minnesota. The gates of hope. Beyond the good news. Our mission is to plant ourselves at the gate of hope, not the prudent gates of optimism, which are somewhat narrower. Not the stalwart, boring gates of common sense, nor the strident gates of self-righteousness. I won't ask anybody to confess right now. Not the strident gates of self-righteousness, which creak on shrill and angry hinges. People cannot hear us there. They cannot pass through. Nor the cheerful, flimsy garden gate of everything is going to be all right. But a different, sometimes lonely place. The place of truth-telling. About our own soul, first of all, and its condition. The place of resistance and defiance, the piece of ground from which you see the world, both as it is and as it could be, as it will be. The place from which you glimpse not only struggle, but the joy of struggle. And we stand there beckoning and calling, telling people what we are seeing, asking people what they see. From the impossible will take a little while. The second reading is from Dan Berrigan. Anybody know Daniel Berrigan? All right, if you're of a certain generation, you know Dan Berrigan and his brother Phil. Daniel Berrigan was an American Jesuit priest, anti-war activist, Christian pacifist, playwright, poet, and author. He founded the Plowshares movement as part of the Plowshares 8. He spent his life advocating against war, caring for AIDS patients, and getting arrested hundreds of times as a witness for peace. Here is the reading which really brings home what we're going to talk about today. I want to suggest a strong note of reserve, of pessimism, of the ambiguous, which it seems to me are the very life, the very nature of life today. And then to ask, in spite of it all, what are we to do with our lives? In spite of it all. That's the key phrase. Zoom, you hear me? What are we to do with our lives? A question which seems to me a peerless source of freedom to the one who dares pose it with seriousness. All right? This is freedom that comes as a result of wrestling with this idea. It seems clear by now, anything short of confronting this question ends up sooner or later in a suffocating dead end. That's me. This is the sermon after the good news. Last week, we started this series with an examination of Ralph Waldo Emerson's Divinity School address, in which he expresses that goodness is eternal and will prevail, and that evil is merely temporary. The address, written to future Unitarian and Congregationalist ministers in 1838, is a hymn to the goodness at the heart of all creation, and especially the heart of all humans. He says, when man opens his mind and heart, he will see to perfection he is born. I mean, that is pretty grand and sweeping, yes? I mean, it doesn't get much more grand and sweeping than that. Jesus is an icon and exemplar, fully human Jesus, though he is, as one who singularly understood the brilliance and goodness at the heart of the human endeavor. And I recalled in that sermon last week that in my own life, in my own struggle, when I got onto the struggle bus, that the words of Carl Scoville, our former minister at King's Chapel, saved me, anchored me, gave me purpose and hope. The great surmise says simply this: at the heart of all creation, there is a goodness, a purposeful goodness from which we come, in which we live our fullest, to which we shall at last return. This goodness is foundational to liberalism, and it isn't going anywhere. No one wants to return to a sense of humanity as depraved, as worms, as in need of some kind of salvation from a God who is always just waiting for you to mess up, right? And still, this triumphalism, this optimism, is it warranted? Is it accurate? Does it ring true? Now remember, Carl Scoville told me in a letter that he borrowed this quote from a Jesuit priest who borrowed it from someone else, undoubtedly, world without end, and it goes all the way back to the Buddha or St. Paul or Jesus and some early Taoist. Borrowing is a thing people like to do with these kinds of ideas. And I thought that Carl Scoville, I told you that he wrote on King's Chapel stationery. He did not. You know, the brain plays tricks on you. Even better, I mean, King's Chapel is pretty good, but even better than a King's Chapel stationery is this little guy, a Luhan, is an incarnation of the Buddha whose unsightly appearance, reminds us that any of us can be enlightened. He knew of which he was, he knew he was writing to. He knew his audience. He borrowed this from a Jesuit. And I remember once telling my dear friend, a fellow chaplain, Father Steve, all I've got, Father Steve, is the idea that there is a goodness from which we come, and which we live our fullest, and to which we shall at last return, and that goodness is ultimate. And Father Steve looked at me, a Nigerian, an immigrant, someone who had told me over and over again about the struggles in his home country. I don't see it like that. That's not my experience. A Catholic priest confronting this Jesuit idea. Father Steve and I spoke often, laughed together, processed trauma that only chaplains bear witness to. I had heard of his experiences, the colonialism, the will to power. I had heard his worries about civil war. We looked at the same broken, beautiful world in very different ways, through entirely different lenses. So, when I knew that I was going to preach on Emerson and the goodness at the heart of all creation, I needed also to acknowledge that life is hard and people aren't overflowing all the time with such goodness. Because Father Steve invited me to look at the lens through which I viewed the world and see that maybe it needed a little adjustment. I mean, look, when Emerson was going on and on about the beauty and goodness just down the road in places like Walden Pond, there was a whole group of invisible folks who were slaves and former slaves. And his teacher, William Ellery Channing, the minister at Federal Street Church, the very father, the grandfather, the scholar that helped usher in American Unitarianism, took decades to acknowledge the sin of slavery because most of his congregants were powerful industrialists who were committed to keeping the status quo. And when he finally spoke out about slavery, his congregation, a group of Unitarians, said, "It may be time for you to go to the next village and be a prophet." He never resigned his pulpit. He just stopped taking his salary and stopped speaking. So goodness at the heart of all things may not be the full story, you see. I have the story about Channing in the back table there. Made some copies. A series on goodness requires the shadow side of that belief. I know I wanted to say something about the other side of goodness, and I happened upon my colleague Nancy McDonald Ladd and her book, After the Good News, Liberal Faith Beyond Optimism. I found out she works, I didn't even know her. I found out she works at River Road, where Marta and I, River Road Unitarian Universalist in Bethesda, where Marta and I worked 21 years ago. I found out that she too loves Merton and Dorothy Day. And I asked her to greet you all. Rick?
Hi, I'm Reverend Nancy McDonald Ladd. I'm very lucky to have been given the time and the space to write the little book that some folks, including Roger, are considering these days, After the Good News, Progressive Faith Beyond Optimism. And Roger asked me to just give a little thought as to why I wrote that book, what the intention behind it is, maybe what the meaning and purpose of it might be in these post-pandemic days. So I think my intention with the text can best be captured in the rather depressing original title of the book, which was Faith Amid the Dead Utopias. I wrote that as a title and began to ponder these ideas because, in fact, a kind of progressive utopian vision was very much alive in the background of the place in which I grew up, New Harmony, Indiana. The town that I grew up in had foundational stories about what it would be like to build a whole new world, to recreate everything that is broken in a wholly reinvigorated world in which all things will be made new. And what I found within Unitarian Universalism is that we didn't stop trying to build progressive and often largely privileged utopias way back in the 19th century. That in fact, progressive people, particularly largely privileged, often white progressive people, can sometimes tell a story about the world we're living in that casts it as a narrative of onward and upward progress forever, in which a utopian vision of what can happen when people think right and act right and do right by being in community, that vision might in fact become real. What it discounts is the tragic dimension of life and history that is apparent always for folks at the margins of power and privilege, and increasingly and unavoidably for every single one of us. I believe that congregational life and Unitarian Universalism and progressive religion more broadly needs to speak not only to the hope and the faithfulness of progressive people, but to the heartbreak and the tragedy and the deep loss and even subjugation at the hands of oppression among progressive people and in our world. Now, I wrote the book before the pandemic. I certainly did not intend to be so prescient to write a book against optimism when the greatest sea change in certainly the last 20 or 30 years of American history was underway. And what I don't want to do is end this contemplation with the idea that optimism is bad or that progress isn't possible. What I do want to say is that progress is only possible when we are honest with each other and when we are honest about the injustices of our age. A new world cannot be built when the foundations are sunk in lies. A new world can be built when, in fact, we begin with the honest heartbreak and the deep lamentation. The liturgies of lament and the words of praise need to come together so that we have some honest basis on which to dream new dreams and reconstruct a more livable world in the ashes of the one that has proven time and time again to be so deadly. So I'm grateful to have participated in and helped to kick off a certain kind of conversation about what progressive religious optimism can and cannot do in these days. And I'm grateful for the next steps of that conversation as we continue to think about what Unitarian Universalism means theologically, who we are in accountable relationship to, and how in this late and eventually post-pandemic age, we can be changed, not just into sunnier, happier versions of ourselves, but into people whose lives have been altered and deepened by the tragedy that we have faced together. So those are my thoughts. I hope you have a great day together. Bye.
I told Nancy, just put on your Meadville sweatshirt and walk around and talk to us. But she gave us that, which is nice. Generation X is having a moment right now, which is nice. We've been ignored for a long time. First, she left liberal Catholicism and welcomed into open arms into Unitarian Universalism, and soon found herself at seminary among liberal Protestants. And the churches in the seminary were preaching this grand narrative of goodness. If folks were just given enough time and enough resources, they would catch up to our way of being in the world. They would look more like us and act more like us and be more like us. We were so flipping self-assured, she said, and so arrogant about our position. She says she felt like a realist spy in the midst of an optimistic bubble. The unflappable self-assurance of privileged white people is exhausting, she says. It is difficult to preach that all things will grow into harmony when things seem to be falling apart. It's even harder to proclaim that this beautiful harmony will be created by the church itself when the church remains centered on the experience and expectation of people who have spent so long comfy and cozy at the center of power. We get into a place of moral superiority, moral self-righteousness, upward and onward, and we'll be the vehicle. Thank you very much. It's exhausting. And it doesn't ring true. Onward and upward is a utopian dream that doesn't serve us well. I could go on and on about the inequalities. I could give you a litany of those lynched at the hands of our government. Again, progress is not the enemy here. It's our lens and the way we tell stories which create our reality about that progress and that upward and onward forever. A lot of folks, like Father Steve, a good, honorable man with a completely different perspective, don't see it that way, and we miss out on hearing a different story, a different viewpoint when we stay in our little bubble. My ministry and so many of Gen X's ministries were officially sanctioned after 9/11. I went up 2 weeks after 9/11 to Boston from DC, 2 weeks after, to see the Ministerial Fellowshipping Committee, to say, I've done my work, I've done my CPE, I've done this. Marta and I took the train out of extreme caution. I preached to the committee of 6 or 7, and they gave me a green light to continue on in seminary and to look for a church, which would be in Iowa. Marta, who is from DC, said, "What is in Iowa?" "Where is that?" She's like, "Is that the one with the potatoes?" "No, that's not the one with the potatoes." We had to take seriously the tragic nature of history. When we talk about upward and onward in this grand vision, we feel like we're speaking cheap grace. We are poised here amidst history, Nancy says, grappling with the legacy of faithful optimism and American progress that our predecessors left for us. blessed and burdened with making meaning during these times. Given the state of this world as we know it, it is difficult to honestly preach the fundamentally utopian idealism of the charismatic white men who came before us. We do not wish to lie anymore. And further, those who come to our churches want an honest word about the tragic nature of both our human life and our history. We understand ourselves through the stories we tell. We began to believe that onward and upward was made in our own image. And we, like everybody else, do everything we can to protect our stories. What we want to say is, Emerson, I am lonely. I am hurting. I am sad. I am broken. I'm not a worm. I'm not depraved. I'm not going to go back to Calvin. But my optimism waxes and wanes. You see, I've driven Juan Melendez, who was on death row because he couldn't speak English and he couldn't afford counsel. And he was innocent and he escaped with his life. I've driven him around the Front Range to give talks. We know each other. He got lucky, and I know for damn sure there are 100 people who didn't get so lucky. Don't talk to me about onward and upward when I've sat next to Juan Melendez. If people are born to perfection, what am I doing here? Where's space for me? Maybe I'm not good enough to come in the doors. People who come to our churches are hurting and want to know they're okay in their sadness, and they want to hear a word of truth. Baldwin reminds us over and over again that there's nothing that white Americans wish more than to be innocent. Miguel de la Torre up at Iliff in Denver reminds us that history is not defined through triumphant meta-narratives, but instead is a kaleidoscope comprised of contradictory and complex untold stories and struggles of the very least among us who remain unnamed. Remind me someday to tell you the story of the 38. Zoom, don't let me forget. Layla Long Soldier reminds us of the 38 Dakota men executed under the orders of President Lincoln the day after Christmas, 1862, the week that he signed the Emancipation Proclamation. Go back and watch Lincoln and you will not see the story told. De La Torre asks us for an awakened hopelessness. Now, I want to leave you with something you can do. I don't want to just bum you out. And I want to leave you with a word: proximity. Proximity. The church is called to be in close, real proximity with those who are on the margins, different from us. Not to get them in our doors, but to hear and see what they hear and see, so that we might be changed, we might be transformed. Nancy tells the story about being in DC with a multicultural, multi-faith coalition. And it was just after the crash, like in 2009 or whatever, 2008. And this multinational corporation, hello Wells Fargo, I don't know who it was, but somebody like that, who had exploited the neighborhoods in DC with these mortgage crazinesses. They decided that they were going to go there and get a multi-million-dollar commitment from that multinational corporation to invest in those neighborhoods. And I want to make sure I get this right. So they get in the cars and they go from Bethesda, like where she is, and all these different places. And one person poured coffee down his tie, and she got lost, and they got stuck in traffic, and they were just a mess. And she says, we were the only ones the Holy Spirit had to work on this, so here we were. And she said they had come up against defeat after defeat after defeat, and tension after tension. And this African American said to her, she says he's the only one who was unperturbed by this. Says, "Ah, Nancy, strange birds roost in the tree of heaven." And what he was talking about was the parable of the mustard seed. You know the mustard seed where it's like, oh, if you just have faith, you can move mountains and your faith will grow and it's a little thing and boom. The mustard seed in that time was a rascal. They grow entirely wild. When it's been sown, it's almost impossible to get the place free of it. The kingdom of heaven is like this massive skyscraper of a shrubbery, she says. But all the birds of the sky, all those weird birds who have no place else to go, come and make their home in the mustard seed shrub. Proximity. We got to find all the weird birds and hang out with them.